June 1940. Across the English Channel, France was burning. The Luftwaffe ruled the sky, and the United States, still neutral, was staring into the future, terrified. Reports from Europe described German fighters climbing higher, turning faster, and tearing through the air like steel hawks. The U.S. Army Air Corps knew one truth. Their current aircraft, the slender, elegant P-36 Hawks and P-43 Lancers, were obsolete before they even reached the front lines. And so, in the middle of that panic, a short, sharp telegram arrived at the desk of a man named Alexander Kartveli, chief designer of Republic Aviation. The Army demanded something impossible: a high-altitude interceptor capable of matching or surpassing anything Germany could build. Kartveli, a Georgian immigrant with the thick accent of an exile and the stubbornness of a visionary, stared at the paper and muttered, "They want a miracle." Then, with a cigarette burning between his fingers, he added softly, "So, we will build one." He began sketching that very night, a monster, not a bird. He wanted to build an aircraft that would survive anything, carry everything, and fly where the air was too thin for others to breathe. He would be a dinosaur, he admitted to his team, but it will be a dinosaur with perfect proportions. That dinosaur would later be known as the Republic XP-47B, the prototype of the most fearsome single-engine fighter of World War II, the P-47 Thunderbolt. When the prototype first appeared on the runway of Farmingdale, New York in May 1941, test pilots laughed. At nearly 10,000 pounds empty, it was 65% heavier than its predecessor. The turbo-supercharger system ran through the entire rear fuselage like a set of steel intestines, giving it an odd, pregnant shape. Its engine, the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, 18 cylinders, 2,000 horsepower, looked like something designed for a bomber, not a fighter. One pilot asked Kartveli half seriously, "This thing actually flies?" Kartveli only smiled. "Fly. It climbs to heaven." And he was right. Once the big radial roared to life, the aircraft leapt off the ground like a charging bull. At 27,000 feet, where Messerschmitts gasped for oxygen, the P-47's turbo-supercharger was still feeding the engine with sea-level air. It was an engineering miracle, a flying fortress disguised as a fighter. But it came with a price. The Thunderbolt was heavy, clumsy at low altitude, and temperamental. During its first training months, it killed more American pilots than Germans ever would. At Bridgeport, Connecticut, the 56th Fighter Group under Major Hubert "Hub" Zemke learned that lesson the hard way. Between September 1942 and January 1943, the group lost 18 pilots and 41 aircraft in training accidents. The P-47 could torque roll on takeoff, ground loop on landing, and dive so fast that its controls froze. "The damn thing tries to kill you before you even meet the enemy," Zemke grumbled. But those who survived the learning curve discovered something extraordinary. Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson, a young farm boy from Oklahoma who would later become one of America's top aces, recalled his first flight. "It was like strapping yourself to a locomotive. You didn't fly it, you aimed it." Then, on April 8, 1943, the monster went to war. Over northern France, 27,000 feet above the town of Caen, a group of 16 brand-new P-47Cs from the 4th Fighter Group climbed awkwardly toward the German coast. Above them, the veteran Luftwaffe ace, Oberleutnant Ralph Hermaken, and his wingman circled in their sleek Focke-Wulf 190 A5s. Hermaken watched through his crystal canopy and laughed over the radio, "The Americans have sent us flying milk bottles." Below them, the Thunderbolts lumbered upward, their 2,000 horsepower engines straining, propellers flashing like silver windmills. To the Germans, who had spent years perfecting fast, lightweight fighters, these barrel-shaped intruders looked ridiculous. But what they didn't know, what no one yet knew, is that these ungainly machines would soon erase the Luftwaffe's very name from the sky. The Thunderbolt carried 8.50 caliber Browning machine guns, each capable of 750 rounds per minute. That means a combined rate of fire exceeding 6,000 rounds per minute, with 3,400 rounds of ammunition stored in its wings, enough to saw a Messerschmitt in half in 2 seconds. It was not a duelist's weapon. It was an instrument of annihilation. Major Donald Blakesley, commander of the 335th Fighter Squadron and one of the first to fly the P-47 in combat, understood what his men did not yet grasp. Survival in this aircraft required abandoning every romantic notion of dogfighting. The Thunderbolt was not built to dance. It was built to kill. "Don't turn with them," Blakesley told his squadron. "Dive, fire, and climb away. You fight them like a hammer fights glass." That April morning, as the German formation approached from above, Blakesley's words would be tested. The Luftwaffe still thought of the sky as a chessboard, ruled by tactics and finesse. The Americans had brought a factory-made battering ram to a fencing match. The clash that followed was brief and brutal, a warning shot from history itself. The Thunderbolt had arrived, and though the Germans laughed that day, within a year, they would no longer laugh at all. The first months of the Thunderbolt's combat life were a study in humiliation and blood. Between April and May 1943, Luftwaffe pilots mocked the new American fighter in their mess halls. "It turns like a freight train," they joked. "It climbs like a pregnant cow." Reports sent to Berlin described it as unsuitable for European air combat. And on paper, they were right. The P-47 couldn't match the Focke-Wulf 190's turning radius or the Messerschmitt 109's climb rate. When forced into a dogfight, it lumbered and stalled, its pilots fighting their own momentum as much as the enemy. But what the Germans didn't yet realize was that the Thunderbolt didn't need to turn. It only needed to survive long enough to point its 8 guns at something. Major Hubert "Hub" Zemke was among the first to understand that. A hard-eyed tactician, he trained his 56th Fighter Group to fight differently. "Use your weight," he told his men. "Use your speed. Use your guns. Don't fight like them, fight like Americans." He forbade traditional dogfighting drills and instead taught his pilots to dive from high altitude, strike with overwhelming firepower, and climb away before the Germans could react. It was an unorthodox doctrine, but Zemke saw it as the only way to turn the Thunderbolt's bulk into an advantage. Then came June 26, 1943, over Le Touquet, France. 48 P-47s of the 61st Fighter Squadron were escorting bombers home when 16 Focke-Wulfs from JG-26 attacked from the sun. Among the Thunderbolts was 2nd Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson, still a rookie, flying at the rear of the formation. In seconds, his aircraft was ripped apart. 21 cannon shells exploded across his fuselage. Hydraulic fluid sprayed the cockpit. Fire flared behind the instrument panel, and shrapnel tore through his nose and leg. When he tried to bail out, he discovered the canopy had jammed shut, welded by a shell explosion in its track. At 27,000 feet, bleeding and half blinded by oil, Johnson realized he was trapped inside a burning coffin. But somehow, the engine, its cowling shredded, one cylinder dead, kept running. Johnson leveled the aircraft and turned toward the English Channel. The Thunderbolt shook and groaned, but it did not die. Then, out of the clouds, a lone Focke-Wulf appeared behind him. The German pilot opened fire with all 4 cannons. Johnson hunched behind his armor plate and waited for death. The shells slammed into the fuselage, dozens, maybe hundreds, but the big radial engine kept turning. The P-47 refused to fall. When the German's cannons ran dry, he circled, incredulous, and switched to his machine guns. Another long burst. The Thunderbolt still flew. Finally, the German pilot pulled alongside, his face pale and disbelieving. Johnson looked at him through the cracked canopy. The man raised a gloved hand, gave a small salute, and banked away toward France. Johnson limped back to England and landed on his belly at Manston Airfield. The crew stopped counting bullet holes after 200. One shell had detonated inches from his head. Another had ripped through the main spar. Yet the aircraft had brought him home. When news of Johnson's survival spread, it changed everything.
Engineers at Republic examined the wreck and realized even they had underestimated the machine's strength. German intelligence dismissed the report as propaganda until their own pilots confirmed it. No fighter they had ever seen could take that kind of punishment. The Luftwaffe began to call the P-47 their Stahlvogel, the steel bird. From that day forward, American pilots started to believe. They no longer saw the Thunderbolt as a clumsy brute, but as an armored guardian. They began to trust its immense power, to dive where no one else dared. If you can see the enemy, Zemke told them, you can kill him. If he can see you, dive. The tactic became known as boom and zoom. Hit hard, hit once, and never turn back. By late summer 1943, those tactics bore fruit. On August 17th, during the Great Schweinfurt-Regensburg raid, Thunderbolt groups encountered waves of twin-engine Messerschmitt 110 Zestrorers, loaded with cannon and rockets, hunting the American bombers. Major David Schilling led his flight of 4 P-47s in a near-vertical dive from 28,000 feet. A German gunner later recalled, "They came down like hammers from heaven. We fired and hit one, but it did not slow. Then it fired. The plane ahead of me turned into confetti. In less than a minute, 8 German destroyers were gone." Each P-47 carried 425 rounds per gun, 3,400 in total, nearly 900 pounds of ammunition. When all 8 guns converged at 300 yards, their combined impact was like a continuous steel saw cutting through the air. Pilots described watching enemy aircraft disintegrate in front of them, wings torn off, fuselages severed, tails vanishing into vapor. Captain Francis "Gabby" Gabreski, who would become the top American ace in Europe, put it simply, "When you hit them with all 8, they don't go down, they explode." The Thunderbolt's reputation was no longer a joke. To the men who flew it, it was indestructible. To the Germans who faced it, it was a nightmare. And to the factories back home, it was proof that American industry could turn metal and fire into a legend. The laughing had stopped. The storm was learning to roar.
Autumn 1943. Across occupied Europe, German ground crews learned to recognize a new sound, an echo that rolled through the clouds like distant thunder. At first faint, then rising to a deep metallic growl, it meant one thing only: the Americans were coming. The roar of the P-47 Thunderbolt, heavy, defiant, and unstoppable, had become the anthem of a changing war. The Luftwaffe, once supreme, was beginning to fracture. Every day the bombers came, first in dozens, then in hundreds, flying straight into the heart of the Reich. Behind them came the Thunderbolts, carving corridors through the sky. The German pilots who had laughed at the flying milk bottles now whispered the name with dread. The difference was altitude. While the Luftwaffe's Focke-Wulf 190s and Messerschmitt 109s gasped for air above 25,000 feet, the P-47's massive turbo supercharger kept the Pratt & Whitney R2800 roaring at full strength. At 30,000 feet, the German engines starved and stumbled, while the Americans climbed higher still. The Thunderbolt owned the stratosphere. One of the Luftwaffe's most decorated aces, Oberleutnant Hans Philipp, learned this the hard way. On October 8, 1943, he led a formation of JG-1 fighters to intercept B-17s near Bremen. At 28,000 feet, his Focke-Wulf began to wheeze, its BMW 801 engine struggling for oxygen. Then from above came the roar. A formation of P-47s from the 56th Fighter Group dove through the clouds like steel meteors. Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson, now an ace himself, spotted Phillips' aircraft, a flash of yellow nose art, a veteran's emblem, and fired a short burst from 300 yards. Observed strikes along entire fuselage, his report read. Enemy aircraft exploded, no parachute observed. The man who had survived over 500 missions across 3 fronts was gone in an instant. For the Luftwaffe, it was more than a death. It was a prophecy. The Thunderbolt had proven that altitude, power, and durability could erase experience itself. Meanwhile, back in Long Island, engineers at Republic were already improving the design. The new P-47D-22 variant featured a Hamilton standard hydromatic propeller with 13-foot paddle blades, broad and heavy, biting deep into the air. The improvement was dramatic. Climb rates jumped from 2,200 to nearly 3,000 feet per minute. For the first time, the Thunderbolt could meet German fighters on equal terms in a climb. But the new propeller did more than change performance. It changed sound. When the paddle blades neared supersonic speeds, they produced a deep rumbling boom that could be heard miles away. German troops began calling it Donnerschlag, the thunderclap. By early 1944, the Luftwaffe was facing a new nightmare. The Thunderbolt no longer operated only above them. It was everywhere. Equipped with external fuel tanks of 108 gallons each, the P-47 could now escort bombers deep into Germany, fighting all the way to the target and back. The Americans erased the Luftwaffe's one advantage: range. The German response was desperation. They began to focus their attacks on bombers, hoping to break the morale of the daylight raids. But the Thunderbolt stood in their path, and they no longer fought defensively. They hunted. Major Hugh Zemke, now leading the legendary 56th Fighter Group, rewrote the rules of aerial warfare. "We are not escorts, we are executioners." He trained his squadrons to climb high above the bombers and dive through attacking German formations in synchronized waves. Each dive was a hurricane of bullets and smoke, the sky turning into a churning wall of fire. German pilots, who once approached bombers with mathematical precision, now dove into chaos. Captain Walker Bud Mahurin, one of Zemke's top pilots, described it simply. It wasn't a dogfight anymore. It was an ambush. The Thunderbolts rolled inverted, dove at speeds exceeding 550 miles per hour, fired and climbed back into the sun. Nothing could catch them in a dive, not even the vaunted Focke-Wulfs. German pilots who tried to follow often blacked out or tore their wings off in compressibility. In February 1944, the new reality struck home. Luftwaffe veteran Heinz Knoke of Jagdgeschwader 11 recorded in his diary, "The fat American fighters have learned to climb. We attacked expecting the old advantage. They followed us up to 30,000 feet. Schmidt was caught and blown apart, nothing left but smoke and fragments. These are not the same machines we laughed at last year." The Luftwaffe began losing aircraft faster than it could replace them. Bombers were bombed, fuel was rationed, and veteran pilots were irreplaceable. Meanwhile, the Americans trained thousands more. For every Thunderbolt destroyed, 3 new ones arrived. By the time of Operation Argument in early 1944, the famous Big Week air offensive, the P-47 had transformed from a clumsy brawler to a precision weapon. When the skies cleared over Germany that spring, they were no longer blue. They were filled with silver wings and the sound of thunder.
While Europe burned, the Pacific roared. Across the endless blue of the South Seas, a different kind of war was being fought, one of distance, heat, and endurance. And here, too, the P-47 Thunderbolt would prove its worth, far from the cold skies of France. When the 348th Fighter Group under Colonel Neil Kirby arrived in New Guinea in the summer of 1943, the men quickly learned that the rules of aerial combat in the tropics were nothing like those over Europe. The Japanese Zero was light, graceful, and deadly below 20,000 feet. The Thunderbolt, by contrast, was massive, heavy, and thirsty for fuel. Yet Kirby saw something the Japanese didn't. At high altitude, the Zero was helpless. On October 11, 1943, Kirby led 4 P-47s over Wewak against 40 Japanese aircraft. The sky was a blazing, humid haze, the sea below a mirror of molten light. The Americans dove from the sun, their turbo-supercharged engines screaming. In less than 10 minutes, Kirby shot down 6 planes himself, a feat that earned him the Medal of Honor. The Japanese pilots, used to dueling fragile American fighters, were stunned. Their cannon shells, which could shatter a P-40 in seconds, seemed to vanish into the Thunderbolt's armor. "We called them monsters," recalled Japanese ace Saburo Sakai. "I fired 20 rounds into one and it still flew. Then it turned and fired. The sky filled with red lines. I barely escaped." The Thunderbolt thrived where logic said it shouldn't. Its huge radial engine, designed for cold European altitudes, actually loved the thin, hot air of the Pacific. Maintenance crews discovered it could absorb sand, heat, and humidity without seizing up. Pilots learned to use its tremendous weight for lethal dives on enemy convoys and airfields. Its 8 heavy machine guns shredded Japanese bombers, barges, and even small ships. But the Thunderbolt's biggest weakness remained range. The Pacific was vast. Battles weren't fought miles apart, but hundreds. In late 1944, Republic engineers unveiled the answer: the P-47N. Its wings were lengthened and reinforced, fitted with built-in fuel tanks that held 93 gallons each. With external tanks, the P-47N could fly 2,350 miles, enough to escort B-29 superfortresses from the Marianas all the way to Japan. The lumbering milk bottle of 1943 had evolved into a long-range Titan. As the island-hopping campaign pushed closer to the Japanese home islands, the P-47 took on new duties. It became a flying artillery piece. Equipped with bombs and 5-inch high-velocity rockets, it obliterated everything that moved. Japanese troops came to dread its howl. It came in low, you could see the face. Then the rocket screamed, and the world ended. The Thunderbolt's armor made it nearly indestructible against ground fire. Even a direct hit from small-caliber flak rarely brought it down. A 2-second burst of its machine guns could melt a convoy of trucks or tear the roof off a bunker. The Pacific Islands began to bear its mark, lines of blackened wreckage stretching from beachheads to jungle trails. By 1945, P-47s flew alongside Mustangs and Corsairs, escorting bombers over Tokyo and strafing airfields in Kyushu and Okinawa. The Japanese Air Force, depleted and desperate, began using kamikazes, pilots who turned their planes into flying bombs. Yet even here, the Thunderbolt proved its strange, grim poetry. Its pilots could spot incoming kamikazes from miles away, dive through clouds of anti-aircraft fire, and destroy them before they reached the fleet. In one engagement off Okinawa, a P-47 pilot fired at a kamikaze so close that the explosion scorched his own aircraft. He still landed safely on Iwo Jima, his plane riddled with holes but still intact. By the time of the Japanese surrender, the Thunderbolt had flown over 500,000 sorties across the Pacific. It had destroyed thousands of aircraft, ships, and vehicles. But for the men who flew it, one truth mattered more than any statistic. It brought them home. Colonel Kirby, who had once called it the Bulldog of the Sky, died in 1944 after refusing to abandon his shot-up aircraft. His last words over the radio: "Tell them she brought me this far." The P-47 in the Pacific was more than an airplane. It was an omen. It showed that even in the most hostile conditions, American engineering could reach anywhere, endure anything, and strike with thunder. From the jungles of New Guinea to the skies over Tokyo, its sound meant one thing: power had come to the Pacific. And when the sun finally set on the war, that sound lingered, the deep, rolling echo of the storm that crossed an ocean.
By early 1944, the P-47 Thunderbolt had gone from a misunderstood giant to the spearhead of daylight air war. But its true baptism of vengeance came not over France or the Pacific, but over Germany itself. Operation Overlord was approaching, and with it the greatest air armada in history. The Thunderbolt, once mocked as too heavy and too slow, was about to become the weapon that made D-Day possible. In the spring of 1944, as Allied planners prepared for the Normandy invasion, the Luftwaffe was already bleeding to death. The relentless air offensives known as Big Week and Operation Argument had torn apart the German aircraft industry. The 8th and 9th Air Forces sent hundreds of B-17s and B-24s deep into the Reich, escorted by Thunderbolts and the new P-51 Mustangs. The Luftwaffe fought back with fury, but it was like punching into a hurricane. P-47 swept ahead of the bomber streams, tearing through enemy formations with guns that never seemed to run dry. Each engagement was an execution. Lieutenant Francis Gabby Gabreski, now the top American ace in Europe, described one such fight. "We saw them climbing to intercept the bombers. I led the flight down at 30,000 feet, dove like a rock and opened fire at 400 yards. The sky filled with debris, no parachutes. It wasn't a battle anymore. It was extermination." The Germans had no answer. Their factories produced aircraft faster than they could train pilots. Fresh recruits with barely 50 hours of flight time were thrown into battle against American aces with hundreds of combat hours. One German squadron leader wrote bitterly, "Our boys can barely start their engines before the Thunderbolts are on them." Then came June 6, 1944, D-Day. Over 500 P-47s blanketed the skies over Normandy, forming an impenetrable wall of steel above the beaches. Every German fighter that dared approach was torn apart. Below, the Thunderbolts strafed convoys, trains, and bridges with machine guns and rockets. Oberlieutenant Wolfgang Fischer, one of the few Luftwaffe pilots to reach the beaches that morning, later recalled, "The sky belonged to the Americans. They were everywhere. At dawn, 12 of us took off. I was the only one to return. Their guns turned us into falling sparks." The following weeks became a nightmare for the German army. The Thunderbolt was no longer just a fighter, it was a flying executioner. It roamed the French countryside by day, attacking anything that moved. Columns of trucks, tanks, and horse-drawn wagons were obliterated in seconds. An officer from the 125th Panzer Grenadier Regiment wrote in his diary, "They came in low, engines howling. You could see the faces of the pilots. The rockets screamed, then the hammer of their machine guns followed. 20 vehicles gone in one pass. We hid in the ditches, covering our ears from the noise. They were not planes, they were iron gods." By the end of June, P-47s of the 9th Air Force had destroyed 651 locomotives, 3,847 trucks, 512 tanks, and over 4,500 horse-drawn vehicles. German movement by daylight became suicidal. The Wehrmacht was forced to retreat only at night, and even then the moonlight brought death from above. The Thunderbolt's lethality was enhanced by a terrifying new addition, rockets. Each 5-inch high-velocity aircraft rocket carried the explosive force of a 105mm artillery shell. 10 of them could turn a column of armor into scrap metal. In the words of one Allied engineer, "We built a fighter that carried the firepower of a destroyer." Yet the P-47's dominance wasn't just in its guns or armor, it was in its endurance. German fighters, plagued by fuel shortages, could only fly brief sorties. The Thunderbolts, with their massive fuel tanks and efficient engines, could patrol for hours, circling the invasion front like hawks. When one squadron ran low on fuel, another was already waiting to replace it. The Luftwaffe's own wanted control of the air had evaporated completely. On the ground, the German soldiers developed a new term, Yabo fever. It was a kind of paralysis, a mix of terror and fatalism that seized entire units at the sound of approaching aircraft. Soldiers froze, unable to move or fire, convinced that the next second would bring thunder and fire. In the following months, as Allied troops pushed toward Paris, the P-47s became both sword and shield, destroying enemy resistance ahead and guarding their own from above. By the time the Allies crossed the Seine, entire German divisions had been crippled not by tanks or infantry, but by the relentless hammer of the Thunderbolts. And through it all, the pilots began to understand that they weren't just fighting a war in the air. They were dismantling an empire, one mission at a time. By August 1944, France was free. The Luftwaffe was in ruins. The P-47 had done its work. But as one German officer captured at Falaise said bitterly, staring at a burning convoy, "It wasn't the bombs that broke us. It was the thunder."
By the dawn of 1945, the once mighty Luftwaffe was a ghost.
Its airfields lay in ruins, its fuel depots burned, and its pilots, those who remained, were young, frightened, and flying machines held together with wire and faith. Against them, the P-47 Thunderbolt now ruled every altitude of Europe. What had begun as a clumsy, overweight experiment had become the symbol of Allied dominance, a machine that embodied not just power, but inevitability. January 1, 1945, brought Operation Bodenplatte, Germany's final desperate gamble to regain control of the skies. Nearly 900 Luftwaffe fighters, including their best remaining pilots, launched surprise attacks on Allied airfields across Belgium and the Netherlands. At Y-34 Airfield near Metz, home of the 365th Fighter Group, the attack initially succeeded. Fires consumed the flight line as German fighters strafed and bombed parked Thunderbolts. 22 P-47s were destroyed in minutes. A captured German pilot, brought before the base commander, smirked at the sight of the burning wreckage. "What do you think of that?" he sneered. Major George Brooking, the commanding officer, didn't blink. He pointed toward the maintenance crews already clearing the runway, dragging wrecks aside. "By tomorrow," he said quietly, "we'll have 40 new ones. How long will it take you to replace your pilots?" Within 48 hours, brand new Thunderbolts were flown in from depots in England. By the end of the week, the 365th was operational again. The Luftwaffe lost 271 aircraft and 213 pilots, men they could never replace. Bodenplatte was supposed to be Germany's resurrection. Instead, it was its requiem. The contrast between the two air forces could not have been starker. While Germany's aircraft industry struggled under constant bombardment, Republic aviation was producing Thunderbolts faster than the Luftwaffe could destroy them. At the peak of production, one P-47 rolled out of the Farmingdale, Long Island factory every hour. Another plant in Evansville, Indiana, built from empty farmland, produced 500 aircraft a month. Each one required 65,000 individual parts, 8 miles of electrical wiring, and 2,000 pounds of aluminum, yet America's factories never slowed. Even more staggering was ammunition production. Each P-47 sortie consumed up to 3,400 rounds of .50 caliber ammunition, and by mid-1944, U.S. arsenals were producing over 30 million rounds per month. The Lake City Arsenal in Missouri ran around the clock, feeding an industrial beast that seemed limitless. In contrast, the Luftwaffe was fighting a machine powered by an entire civilization. The same imbalance held true in pilot training. By 1944, the United States was graduating 30,000 pilots annually, each with over 400 hours of flight training. German pilots were lucky to receive 100 hours total, and most of that was in obsolete trainers. A young Luftwaffe recruit described his first combat sortie. "We had never fired our guns in training. When I saw the Thunderbolts, I froze. They came down like gods." Captured German reports revealed the transformation in their perception of the P-47. In early 1943, it was listed as a large, unmaneuverable fighter, minimal threat. By late 1944, the assessment read, "Dominant fighter bomber, firepower devastating, impossible to destroy in single engagement." By March 1945, the entry was brutally honest. "Best fighter bomber of the war. Direct engagement, not survivable." And yet, even with defeat certain, the Thunderbolt's legend grew. It was no longer just a fighter, it was an idea. The idea that in modern war, industrial power was destiny. The Luftwaffe had begun the war believing in the supremacy of the individual ace, the knight of the sky. The Americans had built an army of engineers, mechanics, and production lines that turned out thousands of machines capable of making any pilot a deadly weapon. The Thunderbolt didn't fight for glory, it fought for efficiency. It was the triumph of industry over ideology. General Adolf Galland, once the head of the Luftwaffe's fighter arm, later admitted, "We laughed when we first saw the Thunderbolt. Too big, too heavy," we said. "The Americans have built a bomber and called it a fighter, but we were the fools. They didn't build a fighter for dueling, they built a weapon for victory."
Galland would later test fly a captured P-47 after the war. He recalled, "The power was unbelievable. It climbed like it was falling upward. The cockpit was spacious and comfortable, the visibility perfect. It was a pilot's airplane wrapped in armor, and the Americans built 15,000 of them while fighting a two-ocean war. When I realized that, I knew we never had a chance." Indeed, Republic Aviation built 15,683 Thunderbolts by the end of the war, the most of any U.S. fighter type. Each one symbolized the might of a nation that could fight in both Europe and the Pacific and still outproduce every enemy combined. The Luftwaffe, by contrast, was grounded, its surviving pilots watching helplessly as Thunderbolts strafed their bases with impunity. By the final months of 1945, the Thunderbolt statistics were beyond comprehension. In Europe alone, it destroyed 3,752 German aircraft in aerial combat, 3,315 on the ground, 86,000 railway cars, 9,000 locomotives, 6,000 tanks and armored vehicles, and over 68,000 trucks. It had flown more than 200,000 combat sorties and dropped over 120,000 tons of bombs. But behind those numbers lay something deeper, a change in the nature of warfare itself. The P-47 had proved that courage, skill, and spirit, the virtues that once defined combat, meant nothing without the machines to wield them. The Thunderbolt turned air combat into an industrial process, precise, methodical, unstoppable. German pilots called it Roosevelt's piano for the rhythm of its guns. Those who heard that sound often never heard anything again. When peace came, the P-47 was retired quietly, replaced by sleeker jets that owed their existence to the technology it had proven. But to those who had flown it or faced it, it remained unforgettable. In 1985, at a reunion of former fighter pilots in Phoenix, Arizona, both German and American veterans stood before a restored Thunderbolt. Galland looked at it for a long time before speaking. He said, "We thought we were fighting men, but we were fighting factories." The P-47 Thunderbolt had done more than win battles. It had ended an era. It buried the age of the lone ace and heralded the dawn of the machine. It was the sound of modern war, the roar of power multiplied by industry. When it came, it brought thunder, and when the thunder spoke, the sky belonged to America.